Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on contract management in TOPdesk. My name's Sarah, and some of you may have met me on site before in my role as a consultant. We left this topic in March when we did a webinar on service level agreements and left you with a cliffhanger there of the second part, which is going to be contract management. So focusing not on our relationship with our customers, but with our suppliers. For more information on this first webinar, you can see this on our YouTube channel, and I'll give a link to this and other webinars at the end of this session. Today's webinar will also be recorded and will be sent out by email and uploaded onto YouTube as well. So fear not if colleagues were unable to attend or if you need to cut this session short. Please ask us any questions throughout the session by using the panel on the right-hand side, and my colleague Amy will respond to you as soon as possible. But any questions we don't get through during this session will be emailed out afterwards. When you aren't using the panel on the right-hand side, if you could just ensure it's collapsed so you can see the whole screen. That's our housekeeping over with. So, what are we going to talk about today? Firstly, I'd just like to cover what are supplier contracts and what will they include, and what's the point in using them, why are we using contracts. We're then going to look at 7 steps to creating effective contracts in TOPdesk, and then we're going to cover the life cycle of a service contract, so how we can actually manage that contract once it's activated. And finally, we'll end today's session with just an active walkthrough of managing an incident where a supplier service was required. So this diagram should be familiar from our first webinar together. And here we can see the relationship between us as the service organisation, both with our customers in the form of the SLA contract, and between ourselves and our suppliers in the form of the supplier contract. And we can see that suppliers may be involved in resolving issues for our customer as part of the wider service provision. So it's important that we create both our SLA contracts and our supplier contracts, not in isolation, but rather we ensure that they support one another. And we'll return to this point later on in the presentation. But for now, I'd like to focus on the supplier contract. So this is between ourselves and potentially multiple suppliers, which we speak to as part of our service desk role. So why use supplier contracts in the first place? To start with, for our financial overview, we can capture our financial information associated with our contracts to gain a deeper understanding of our outgoings. By capturing the time and dates of our contracts, we can also be aware of how long we're tied in for a contract. For example, by putting in end dates and cancellation periods, we can make sure we're not staying with a contract when it's actually stopped serving us. We can define our agreements with our supplier, and we can be really specific here as to what service they provide us. And with this, we'll avoid any ambiguity with both sides on the contract. And finally, we can also document the internal responsibilities that we have around this contract. So if we have a specific person who needs to liaise with the supplier, if things go wrong with the contract, we can document it here so everyone's clear who our contact person is. This is especially useful when we're dealing with a service department where we're working with very large teams. And what is in a supplier contract? So I've already alluded to some of these points, and we've got our agreements with suppliers where we've captured our specific dates, the costs associated, and details of the service that they're providing, with lead times for a resolution if they're also involved in our incident management process. And finally, we'll capture the contacts of the responsible persons associated with the contract. And who might those people be? So there's actually, there could be a number of roles involved with a supplier contract. So we have, to start with, the contract manager, who's often the head of a department or of a service provision within your organisation. We have our budget holder, and this is the person who needs to manage the pot of money where the contract is being paid by. We have the operator group. So this is more for the day-to-day contact and interaction with the supplier, the people who will be responsible for getting in touch if we need to rely on their services. And then we have the supplier itself with their contact persons. So for example, at TOPdesk, you may have a link with an account manager, a consultant, inside sales or support staff, and we would all be contact persons within your environment. And then there may be people outside of TOPdesk which need to be involved in this process. So for example, procurement may need to be involved if a supplier contract is over a certain amount of money. So these are just some things to take into consideration. And then how do we implement these contracts within TOPdesk? So often when I go on site, people have a vague understanding of some of the contracts that they have, but they're not often all stored in one place. It may be that we've started off with an Excel spreadsheet, or we simply just have some in our drawer, but trying to put them all into one place just means that we can manage this information better. And when we're implementing contracts, we're looking at two areas really. We're looking at the supplier contract itself with those dates, and we're looking at the services that they provide, and we can build those up individually. So we're going to go through now some simple steps of things to consider to quickly build up this information within TOPdesk. And we're going to go through this content quite quickly, but obviously on site during consultancy, this would be discussed at a slower pace. So these are going to be our 7 steps. And by the end of step 7, we should have an active contract within TOPdesk. So step 1, our suppliers. So to start with, we need to create a supplier card within supporting files. And I've noted there to ensure that the supplier has the relevant tasks. Now for us to involve our suppliers in our incident management process, we just need to check box there that they're a first line call supplier and a second line call supplier so that they appear in the relevant drop-down lists. Also within supporting files, we need to make sure the operators or the operator groups associated have this checkbox enabled, which is to say that they're a contract manager. This then means that in the contract itself, which we'll build within the SLA module, that they can appear under this management tab here on the left. And then I'd just like to go through some of the main fields to fill in on the SLA contract itself. So we're looking at the top here to our contract number, which you can supply, or TOPdesk can auto-populate it if you don't have a specific contract number. Obviously, the supplier itself is very important, and then adding in those contract details. Now, to save a contract, we need to have the start and end date in as standard, but it's also useful to add in a cancellation date if we have that information, and a reminder date for the review prior to that cancellation date. And then to that supplier contract, we can link specific supplier services. Now, it may be that a supplier service doesn't directly impact the customer to uphold their service provision. So, for example, it could be that we have a supplier that will come on site and look at server maintenance. Not all contracts with a supplier service will have the bottom 2 fields, the first line duration and second line duration filled in, because it may be that we're not linking these to incidents. But in this example, the important fields to fill in are just the brief description. So we've got an overview of what that contract is. We don't need to rely on the contract number to tell us this. And and the second line duration, which we'll see when we do the walkthrough later on, that we can pass that ticket over to our supplier at the second line. Next, if there are specific objects that are involved in this contract, so in this example, we're looking at PCs, that we've linked those objects to that contract, and also that we've linked the right geographical location. So it may be that for some remote IT services, it's across the board. But in other instances, for example, a facilities customer, where they're going to go on site and fix things, it may be that they're bound to a particular region or location. And once we've thought of these areas, our final step is to validate the contract. And what does this mean? So once we've carried out these steps in TOPdesk, typically a contract with a third party, it won't be open-ended. So we will want to go back to our contract that we've enabled and review and evaluate this. So to begin with, we have our contract design that we've enabled, which is now in the active contract phase. We can then offer a signaling date where we may want to begin an evaluation period of these services. So this is prior to any notice period that we need to give the supplier, just so that we can review, look at our SLA reports and see how the supplier is servicing us. It may be that we're happy to extend the contract without making any amendments to its content, and we can do so in TOPdesk by clicking on the amend the contract, and all we need to do there is just capture the new end dates. It may be, however, that we choose to terminate the contract, and if we do so, the terminated contract will just be stored in TOPdesk as a reference. A common question that I get around contracts and this life cycle is, how do we amend the content of a contract once it's active? And to do that, we don't actually amend the original. We would have to make a copy of the original, amend the fields necessary, and then make the amendment active. We would then have to terminate the original contract. And the reason we would do this is to clearly distinguish any amendments and show that the amendments to that contract had the relevant sign-off. So far we've looked at the functionality of creating a contract in TOPdesk. However, this hasn't really given consideration as to how we may use our supplier services to support the provision of services to our own customer base. So that's what I'd like to touch on next. Again, we're coming back to this diagram where really the end user is our main focus, and our suppliers are there to support us in helping them. So just some points to consider in this relationship. Firstly, are the core services we provide supported by appropriate supplier contracts? So do we have the right infrastructure in place with our suppliers to be able to achieve the targets that we've set out for our end user? May we need different supplier contracts for different geographical areas? So again, as I've said, we may have a supplier which can support TOPdesk UK. However, they won't be the same supplier that's supporting the TOPdesk Netherlands branch. And finally, and really the most important, I would say, and often the most overlooked, is that for incident management process, do the lead times match? And what I mean by that is, have we offered realistic timeframes to our end user in relation to what our supplier can offer us? Because there's really no point in saying to our end user that we can have a turnaround time of, say, 3 hours if our supplier has a 2-day lead time. The numbers, they just don't match up. So how can we actually support our services within TOPdesk with our supplier contract? So here I'm within a service page to my end user, and I've checkboxed that it depends on an underpinning service. And then here I can specify the contract and the supplier's service. So then the lead time of the supplier's service will be taken into consideration. at the second line, as we can see at the very bottom. I'm now going to demonstrate how that looks in real life and how by filling out these fields on the supplier contract that we can process our tickets more effectively. So here's our scenario. TOPdesk UK, the laptops are being repaired by Dell, and it's been agreed that there's a specific fix, time fix to fix the issue. And unfortunately, John Dean has got a problem with his laptop, and he's reported it to the IT department who are processing the ticket. So here's our ticket here. So some of the details are already filled in. He has a problem with his fan, and that needs to be escalated to Dell. And how do I do that? By clicking on the partial calls here and creating a new partial call. I can then put the supplier to Dell. And then because this pen nib is dark blue, there's a relevant supplier service that I can link. And this is the specific service which is going to help me with my laptop repair. And once I've double clicked on that, we have our duration for Dell to come and help is 4 hours. I can then leave a note to them. So and I can save that. That will then send the relevant information off to my supplier by using the events and actions. I'll discard this for now. And by sending that email, Dell then have the information and the clock starts ticking for them. So really, in that demonstration, when Dell have finished processing the ticket, it then goes back to us at the second line to go back to the customer to check that they're satisfied and to close that ticket down. And that essentially are all the steps that you need to take to implement contract management within TOPdesk and to start using it to really bring in your suppliers with your incident management process. If you have any questions, as I've said, please send them on to Amy and we will send them out via email. And thank you for attending. As I said at the beginning, here's the link to our first webinar on SLAs and just a general link to our TOPdesk YouTube channel. Thank you very much for attending.